My name is Adam Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and 3 nights before Christmas, my younger brother leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said loud enough for the entire table to hear, 38, still no kids. Guess success can't buy a real family. Everyone laughed. My father laughed the hardest, while my mother raised her glass and whispered with that familiar smile, "He's only joking." I smiled too, but only because none of them knew why I had really come back to Ohio. I hadn't flown home for Christmas. I had come because 3 days earlier, a confidential folder landed on my desk with my own signature at the bottom of a contract I had never signed. My family's company was about to be sold for millions, and according to those papers, I had supposedly handed over the invention that saved the business years ago. The only problem was, that signature wasn't mine. My family always believed I was the quiet son who would never fight back. They knew me as the engineer who left home, built a successful career in Chicago, and never looked back. What they never cared to know was that I had created the acoustic panel that rescued Bennett Acoustics from bankruptcy 14 years earlier. My father proudly called it the Bennett design, but he never once mentioned that I had designed it alone in a freezing workshop when I was 24. I let him take the credit because I thought keeping peace was more important than recognition. But peace has a price, and eventually someone sends you the bill. As dinner continued, my brother kept making jokes about my life, while my father reminded everyone that the Bennett name always comes first. My mother nodded quietly, repeating the same words she'd said my entire life. "Let's not ruin Christmas." I looked around the table and realized something painful. They didn't miss me. They only missed the version of me that stayed silent. So I gently placed my glass on the table and said, "There's actually something none of you know. I've been married for 6 years." The room froze. My mother's smile disappeared. My brother almost dropped his fork. My father stared at me like I'd betrayed him. Questions exploded from every direction. "Married? To who? Why didn't you tell us? How could you hide this from your own family?" Funny. Nobody asked if I was happy. Nobody cared who my wife was. They only cared that I had kept something from them. I answered calmly, because I wanted one part of my life that belonged only to me. They couldn't understand that. How could they? Every dream I'd ever shared with them had either become a joke or something they claimed as their own. I didn't tell them my wife's name. I didn't tell them where she worked. I simply watched them struggle with the idea that, for once, there was a chapter of my life they couldn't control. But while they were still shocked by my marriage, I was thinking about something far more dangerous. A forged signature sitting inside a filing cabinet less than 3 miles away. The signature that could destroy everything my father had spent 50 years building. And sitting there at that Christmas table, listening to them laugh, judge, and question me, I realized something for the very first time. The biggest secret in the room wasn't my marriage. It was the fact that someone in my own family had stolen my name. The biggest secret in the room wasn't my marriage. It was the fact that someone in my own family had stolen my name. The next morning, I drove to Bennett Acoustics, pretending I simply wanted to see the old building decorated for Christmas. The lobby looked nothing like the place I remembered. Fresh paint covered the walls, expensive glass offices had replaced the old workshop, and investors wearing designer coats walked beside my father as he proudly gave them a tour. I stayed in the background, listening carefully. "Everything you see here belongs to Bennett Acoustics," my father said with complete confidence. "Every design, every patent, every invention has been legally transferred to the company. Every signature is complete." The investors smiled and nodded while taking notes. My stomach tightened, because I already knew at least one of those signatures had never been written by me. I casually asked if I could look through the intellectual property files. Before my father could answer, my younger brother stepped in front of me with a fake smile. "Why would you need to see those documents, Adam? You haven't worked here in years. This isn't really your business anymore." Several employees turned to look at us. My mother quickly walked over carrying a tray of coffee and said the same sentence she had used my entire life. "He's only joking." I smiled politely, but inside something had already changed. I stopped asking for permission. A few minutes later, an old technician named Dale quietly found me near the loading dock. He looked around to make sure nobody was watching before whispering, "Follow me." He led me into a small office where the investor due diligence binder had been left open on a conference table. "You've got 5 minutes," he whispered, before standing outside the door. My hand stayed perfectly calm as I turned the pages until I reached the section marked Intellectual Property Assignments. Then I saw it, my invention, my acoustic panel, and underneath it, a document transferring every legal right to Bennett Acoustics. At the bottom was my name, my signature, except it wasn't mine. Someone had copied it almost perfectly, but not perfectly enough. I've signed my name thousands of times. I know every curve, every stroke, every tiny mistake my hand naturally makes. This signature looked close, but the first letter leaned the wrong way. The final line ended too neatly, and the entire signature sat perfectly straight across the page. Mine never does. Mine always slopes slightly downward because of an old injury to my wrist. Whoever forged it had practiced, but they hadn't been me. I took out my phone and quietly photographed every single page. Then I looked at the date. 5 years ago. My heart almost stopped, because on the exact day this document claimed I was sitting in Ohio signing away my invention, I was actually in Amsterdam speaking at an international engineering conference. I still had my passport, my hotel receipts, conference photos, even videos from the presentation. It was impossible for me to have signed that paper. This wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't paperwork, it was fraud. I carefully closed the binder exactly the way I found it and walked back into the lobby. My father was laughing with the investors, proudly shaking hands while telling them the company had a perfect legal history. I looked at him, smiled politely, and for the first time in my life I realized I knew something he didn't know. I knew the truth, and he had no idea I had already discovered it. I carried those photographs in my pocket all afternoon and acted like nothing had happened. I smiled when the investors smiled. I shook hands when they shook mine. But inside, every single word my father spoke sounded different now. Every time he proudly said, "Everything here belongs to the Bennett family," all I could think was, "No, Dad, one of those things still belongs to me." That evening, after the investors left, I stayed behind to help my mother clean up the kitchen. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for the truth. While drying the dishes, I casually asked, "Mom, do you remember me signing the paperwork that transferred my invention to the company?" She didn't even look up. "Oh, sweetheart," she smiled softly. "Your father handled all of that years ago. You were always so busy building your own career. He said there was no reason to bother you with legal papers, since everything was staying in the family anyway." My hands froze. She had no idea what she had just admitted. To her, it wasn't forgery. It was love. It was simply a father taking care of his son. I quietly finished drying the last plate, thanked her, and walked upstairs. My father was sitting alone in his study with a glass of bourbon, reviewing tomorrow's closing documents. I closed the door behind me. He looked up and smiled. "Everything all right, son?" I placed my phone on his desk and opened the photograph of the forged contract. "I found this today." His smile disappeared. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Then something happened that shocked me even more than the forgery itself. He didn't deny it. He slowly leaned back in his chair and quietly said, "So, you finally found it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You forged my signature." He calmly took another sip of bourbon before answering. "You built that invention inside my company, using my equipment, under my roof. It always belonged to Bennett Acoustics. You were too busy chasing your own dreams, so I finished the paperwork you should have signed years ago." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "Dad, that's a crime." He shook his head. "No, Adam. It's called protecting the family." Then his voice became colder. "Do you know what's at stake tomorrow? Hundreds of jobs, your mother's retirement, everything this family spent 50 years building. If you destroy this deal over one signature, everyone will blame you." There it was again, the same pressure I'd carried my entire life. Be the good son. Stay quiet. Carry everyone else's burden. Sacrifice yourself so the family can survive. For years, that's exactly what I had done. But something inside me refused to bend this time. Without saying another word, I stood up and walked out of his office. He called after me, but I didn't stop. I drove back to the company one last time that night. Dale quietly unlocked the building and let me inside. I walked alone through the dark lobby until I reached the glass display holding the very first acoustic panel I had ever built. A gold plaque underneath proudly read, "The Bennett Signature Panel, created by founder Richard Bennett." My name wasn't anywhere on it. I carefully lifted the panel off the wall and turned it around. On the unfinished wooden frame, exactly where I had hidden it 11 years earlier, were my initials carved by hand. A B. Underneath them was a sentence I had written when I was 26 years old. The quietest voice is often the one telling the truth. I gently ran my fingers across those faded letters and felt tears fill my eyes. The front of the panel belonged to my father's story, but the back still belonged to mine. Standing alone inside that silent building, I finally understood something that changed my life forever. Forgiveness and surrender are not the same thing, and tomorrow morning, I was done surrendering.